Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Friday, November 10th, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today, a U.S. official says the Gaza death toll is likely higher. So a senior U.S. official said that the death toll caused by Israel's assault on Gaza is likely far higher than the over 10,000 number that's being reported by Gaza's health ministry. So these comments were made by Barbara Leaf. She is an assistant secretary of state for Near Eastern Affairs. And what she said breaks from President Biden's claim that the numbers from Gaza's health ministry can't be trusted. She said, quote, "In this period of conflict and conditions of war, it is very difficult for any of us to assess what the rate of casualties are. We think they're very high, frankly, and it could be that they're even higher than are being cited. We'll know after the guns fall silent. We take in sourcing from a variety of folks who are on the ground. I can't stipulate to one figure or another. It's very possible they're even higher than is being reported," end quote. So the latest numbers from Gaza's health ministry on Thursday put the death toll at 10,569 Palestinians, and that includes 4,324 children, and thousands more are missing, presumed to be under the rubble, including over 1,000 children, which is horrific to think about. And they say 25,000 have been injured. And again, this is all the way that they report this death toll is by tracking everybody that's going into the hospital. So then there's also the chance that some bodies are being buried before they go to the hospitals, or instead of going to hospitals or morgues. And if you remember, there was that one Israeli report that put the death toll around 20,000. So there's a lot of signs here that it could be much higher than this 10,000 number. And after President Biden accused the Palestinians of lying about the death toll, the UN and aid groups that have experience in Gaza, backed the numbers from Gaza's health ministry, saying that they're generally reliable, and also saying that they think the death toll is actually higher. So it's just really something else here to see that President Biden, and you also saw this from John Kirby, the spokesman for the National Security Council, trying to downplay the death toll here. At the same time, they're saying that thousands of innocent civilians have been killed by Israel and Gaza, but also trying to wave away the numbers. Really the only sort of estimate that we have when it comes to the casualty rate, and then just have another official from the administration coming out and saying this. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. says that Israel agreed to 4-hour daily pauses in Gaza. So the White House said Thursday that Israel had agreed to daily 4-hour pauses, while President Biden said that there was still no possibility of a formal ceasefire. So still sticking to these pauses that they're pushing for. And the idea of the pause is to allow civilians in the north to flee to the south. The fighting and the airstrikes have been the heaviest in the north, but Israeli airstrikes have continued to hit South Gaza as well. So it's not like it's a safe place for them to flee. Always have to keep that in mind. So later in the day, Israel's military downplayed the pauses. An Israeli military spokesman said, quote, "There is no ceasefire. I repeat, there's no ceasefire. It is a tactical pause for the movement from a specific area to the south," end quote. So Biden said that he also asked Israel to agree to a 3-day pause to facilitate Hamas releasing some hostages, but there's no sign yet that Netanyahu will agree to this proposal. So the New York Times reported that CIA Director William Burns met with Qatari officials in Doha on Thursday to discuss a potential hostage deal. Now, there is some Hamas political leadership in Qatar, so they serve as mediators, the Qataris. And one idea that is being discussed would involve Hamas releasing 10 to 15 hostages, including some Americans and other foreign nationals. This is similar to a proposal that Axios reported the other day that I think I covered on here. And the New York Times report said that Hamas has asked for a 3-day pause to release the small group of hostages. And that report from Axios said that the idea would be for during the 3-day pause, they would confirm the names of the hostages and then give the list to the Israelis or to the U.S. But Israeli officials are maintaining that there will be no sort of ceasefire unless Hamas releases all the hostages. The Biden administration has refused to use the term ceasefire when discussing the proposals. And this really shows, they're not trying to end the war. They're just trying to have more control of it. And this is also for PR purposes. So they could say, oh, we're doing humanitarian pauses. We're letting them go to the south. We're letting aid come in. But at the same time, you have all the aid organizations saying, these pauses are useless if there's no ceasefire. They have to stop the bombing to save these people that are living in these horrific conditions in Gaza. So the next one here, Netanyahu rejected a ceasefire-for-hostages deal in Gaza. So this is a report from The Guardian, and it's about a potential deal that was on the table a little earlier than now, a few weeks ago. So Netanyahu rejected a deal for a 5-day ceasefire with Palestinian militant groups in Gaza in return for the release of some of the hostages held in the territory early in the war, according to sources familiar with the negotiations. So the sources said that the Israeli prime minister rejected the deal outright in negotiations soon after Hamas militants staged an unprecedented incursion into Israeli territory on October 7th, killing an estimated 1,400 people. Negotiations resumed after the launch of the Israeli ground offensive on the 27th of October, but the same sources said Netanyahu had continued to take a tough line on proposals involving ceasefires of different durations in exchange for varying number of hostages. So based on this, it sounds like Netanyahu's not going to go for this 3-day pause idea. So others indicated that negotiations which took place prior to the ground invasion involved a far larger number of hostages, with Hamas proposing the release of dozens of foreign nationals captive in Gaza. The Israeli Prime Minister's office, they didn't comment on this report. So it's estimated that Hamas has 240 people. They say Hamas has most of them. Palestinian Islamic Jihad is holding some of them as well. And there is a lot of protests going on now in Israel calling for negotiations, calling for Netanyahu to get the hostages released through diplomacy, including many of the families of those held in Gaza. So according to 3 sources familiar with these talks, the original deal on the table involved freeing children, women, and elderly and sick people in exchange for a 5-day ceasefire, but the Israeli government turned this down and demonstrated its rejection with the launch of the ground invasion. So this report's kind of weird because at first it makes it sound like this deal was right after October 7th, but then they say Israel rejected it by launching the ground invasion, which was launched on October 27th, so 20 days later. So again, it's just another sign that Netanyahu is not going to go for any kind of multi-day pause or ceasefire. He's full steam ahead. All right, so the next one here, journalists slam media coverage of Gaza for enabling massacres. So this article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute, and it says an open letter signed by over 750 journalists, including those from mainstream Western outlets, slams the Israeli government for killing civilians and journalists in Gaza. The signatories condemn newsrooms for failing to give the Palestinians a fair voice and justifying the Israeli onslaught. So this letter was signed by journalists at Reuters, the Los Angeles Times, Jewish Currents, MSNBC, Bloomberg, the Boston Globe, and the Washington Post, and it blasts Israel for, quote, its devastating bombing campaign and media blockade in Gaza, which threatens news gathering in an unprecedented fashion. As reporters, editors, photographers, producers, and other workers in newsrooms around the world, we are appalled at the slaughter of our colleagues and their families by the Israeli military and government. We are writing to urge an end to the violence against journalists in Gaza, end quote. So the Committee to Protect Journalists reports that since the start of the military operations in Gaza, 34 Palestinian journalists have been killed. 34 in just over a month. And this really shows, how things are changing when it comes to Israel. All those media outlets that I listed off there, they're pretty mainstream outlets. And for the most part, the mainstream media is still leaning pro-Israel, but not nearly as much as it used to. So again, Israel's really losing control of the narrative. And I think big part of the reason why is just, the social media era now. Everybody's got Instagram, Twitter, and they could see, what's happening in Gaza with their own eyes. That's why they want to keep killing journalists. All right, so the next one here, 4 more attacks on U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria. So U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria have been attacked by rockets or drones 4 times since the U.S. launched another round of airstrikes in eastern Syria on Wednesday. So this is showing, they're saying they do these airstrikes and they say they're for deterrence and that they don't want escalation. But as I predicted, these Shia militias are not going to back down. And U.S. forces, so they said there was 4 attacks, and there was reports of at least 3 separate attacks in Iraq. I didn't see the report on what the 4th attack, if that was in Syria or Iraq, but either way, that the bases have been targeted pretty evenly in Syria and Iraq in the last few weeks. And the Pentagon said that since October 17th, U.S. forces have been attacked 46 times now due to President Biden's support for Israel's campaign in Gaza, and a total of 56 American troops have been injured. So the casualty number continues to rise. Still no dead. There was a contractor who had a heart attack during one incident. I think it was like a shelter in place, a false alarm, and a civilian contractor. They didn't say what nationality died of a heart attack. But so far, no U.S. troops are dead. But if things keep up like this, it's only a matter of time. And the leader of Kateb Saeed al-Shuhada, which is one of Iraq's Shia militias, said Thursday that the attacks on U.S. forces would continue until there is a ceasefire in Gaza. So they are linking this directly to the U.S. support for what's happening in Gaza. So this is, the leader of this militia group said, quote, "There will be no truce with the U.S. occupation in Iraq unless a genuine and binding ceasefire is established in the Gaza Strip," end quote. So an umbrella group of Iraqi Shia militias known as the Islamic Resistance in Iraq has taken credit for many of these attacks. And the airstrikes that the Pentagon launched late Wednesday that I covered in yesterday's show, they said that it targeted a weapons storage facility used by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, and its affiliates, referring to these militias. So this is unconfirmed, this report of casualties from the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which is based in the UK. Their numbers change a lot. So again, this is unconfirmed. The Pentagon has not reported any casualties in its airstrikes, but the observatory is saying that their sources say 9 people were killed in the U.S. airstrikes, and they describe them as people working with Iranians. So I would assume that it's members of the militias, but it did say 3 of them were Syrian. So again, not confirmed, and the Pentagon has not said anything about casualties. But the attacks, again, things are just going to keep escalating, and they're threatening to do more airstrikes. So, I wouldn't be surprised if they start doing them, more rapidly, more airstrikes. The last one was October 27th and November 8th. I wouldn't be surprised if we see more in just a couple days now. All right, so the next one here, top U.S. general says that Israel killing civilians will help Hamas recruit. So chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Charles Q. Brown, and he just replaced Mark Milley as the top. So the Joint Chiefs chairman, that's the highest ranking military officer in the U.S., he just replaced Mark Milley last month. And these are his first comments that I've seen about the war in Gaza, and he said something pretty interesting. He expressed concern that Israel's killing of Palestinian civilians will help Hamas recruit more militants and cautioned against a long war in Gaza. So he was asked by reporters if the high civilian casualty rate will create more Hamas fighters and said, quote, "Yes, very much so. And I think that's something we have to pay attention to. That's why when we talk about time, the faster you can get to a point where you stop the hostilities, you have less strife for the civilian population that turns into someone who now wants to be the next member of Hamas," end quote. So he also described Israel's goal of eliminating Hamas as a large order, but he did not call for a ceasefire, and he also claimed that Israel was following the laws of war despite the massive civilian casualty rate, the massive child casualty rate. So, it's interesting just to see him make comments like that. It almost seems more critical than things, Blinken has been saying and, the supposed diplomats. And it reminded me that there was this report in the New York Times last weekend. They quoted a U.S. official who said, despite this massive air campaign, all these airstrikes, all the people that are being killed, Israel has not come close to destroying Hamas. And I just want to read the excerpt from this New York Times report. Again, I covered this, I think, on Monday, but I think it's worth repeating. The report said, quote, "One senior U.S. defense official who spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss sensitive details said the operations so far have not come close to destroying Hamas's senior and middle leadership ranks," end quote. And at that point, what was the death toll then? I mean, it was close to 10,000. It was 9,700, and still haven't even come close. And, you think about what General Brown is saying here, and you put yourself in the shoes of people. If you're in Gaza and you're a young man and your whole family was wiped out by an Israeli airstrike, say you live in North Gaza and the Israeli army's invading, I mean, they're just very likely to pick up a rifle and start fighting them, if they're killing their family. That's just, even if they don't join Hamas. I mean, there's other militant groups, but if anybody that's willing to pick up a rifle and fight is going to do it, it's very obvious. So, it's just, you don't see too many people point that out. All right, so the next one here, Smotrich demands security zones around West Bank settlements. This article is from Connor Freeman at the Libertarian Institute. So Israel's finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, the leader of the religious Zionism party in the ruling right-wing coalition, demanded that Israel impose security zones around illegal settlements in the occupied West Bank on Monday. The letter Smotrich has sent to Netanyahu and to Israel's defense minister includes an insistence that Palestinians be kept away during the ongoing olive harvest season. And the Palestinians who are trying to harvest their olives are coming under attacks from settlers who are, attacking them and shooting them and burning their trees down. It's just a really horrific situation right now in the West Bank. And Smotrich is one of the more extreme members of the Netanyahu government. He's a settler. That's the thing, is that they have settlers in their new government, and they're explicitly in favor of annexing the West Bank, pushing the Palestinians out. I was reading something today. I didn't realize in the West Bank there's a population of 500,000 Israeli settlers. I didn't realize it was that much. And then the population of Palestinians is about 3 million. But 500,000, I mean, that's not something Israel's going to be able to roll back. And it's clearly not something that this current Netanyahu government wants to roll back. So when you hear people talk about a two-state solution, 1967 borders, it just doesn't seem realistic at all. So murders of Palestinians by settlers and soldiers in the West Bank are soaring while Israel is waging its unprecedented bombing campaign in Gaza. So at least 175 Palestinians have been killed and thousands injured in the West Bank since October 7th. And, there's some anecdotes in here about just horrific attacks by settlers who are being, armed with rifles and backed by the military, going into people's homes, threatening them, telling them they're going to kill them if they don't leave. They've pushed out, nearly 1,000 people have been displaced just since October 7th. And, this stuff is always going on the West Bank, but these numbers are huge. It's usually at a much lower scale. So they're very much taking advantage of the the tensions and the war. All right, so the next one here, Gaza fights in breadlines, despair in shelters. So this article is from AP, and it's just about the situation for the people on the ground in Gaza, and I just want to read some of it. So fistfights break out in breadlines. Residents wait hours for a gallon of brackish water that makes them sick. Scabies, diarrhea, and respiratory infections rip through the overcrowded shelters, and some families have to choose who eats. So they quote Susan Wahadi. She's an aid worker and a mother of 5 at a UN shelter. And she said, quote, "My kids are crying because they are hungry and tired and can't use the bathroom. I have nothing for them," end quote. So Palestinians who managed to flee Israel's ground invasion in northern Gaza now encounter scarcity of food and medicine in the south, and there is no end in sight to the war that was sparked by the Hamas attack on October 7th. Over 500,000 displaced people have crammed into hospitals and UN schools turned shelters in the south. The schools, overcrowded, strewn with trash, swarmed by flies, have become a breeding ground for infectious disease. Since the start of the war, several hundred aid trucks have entered Gaza through the southern Rafah crossing, but aid organizations say that's a drop in the ocean of need. For most people, each day has become a drudging cycle of searching for bread and water and waiting in lines. And this article just goes on to say how it is straining Gaza's close-knit society. People are getting mad at each other, and this is what happens when populations don't have enough food to eat. People turn on each other and very ugly things can happen. And, talking about the disease and stuff, I mean, if this war continues, and it looks like it's going to continue, I think we're going to start seeing a lot of Palestinians die of disease and hunger. And it's just going to be, it's just an untenable situation for these people, just crammed into these shelters with nowhere to go. All right. So the next one here, sorry, my computer is acting a little slow. All right, so the next one here is some good news, some rare good news. Republicans and Democrats unite for Julian Assange, believe it or not. So a bipartisan group of 16 members of Congress has called on President Biden to drop the case against WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, warning of the grave threat to press freedom if he is convicted. So the lawmakers made this call in a letter sent to President Biden on Wednesday. The effort was led by Representatives Thomas Massie, Republican from Kentucky, and James McGovern, Democrat from Massachusetts. They began circulating this letter to get their colleagues to sign last month. If you remember, I did cover that when there was news that they were circulating the letter. So now they have sent it. I wish they could have gotten more signatures than 16, but it's something. So one excerpt from the letter, it reads, quote, "It is the duty of journalists to seek out sources, including documentary evidence, in order to report to the public on the activities of government. The United States must not pursue an unnecessary prosecution that risks criminalizing common journalistic practices and thus chilling the work of the free press. We urge you to ensure that this case be brought to a close in as timely a manner as possible," end quote. So the members of Congress who signed this, I want to tell you who they are. AOC, Democrat Jamal Bowman, Democrat Ayanna Presley, Democrat Greg Casar, Democrat Ilhan Omar, Democrat Cori Bush, Democrat Rashida Tlaib, Democrat Eric Burleson, Republican, I never heard of him, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Republican, Paul Gosar, Republican, Jesus Garcia, Democrat, Pramila Jayapal, Democrat, Matthew Rosendale, Republican, and Senator Rand Paul, Republican. So Rand Paul was the only senator to sign it. And this letter comes as the Biden administration has been under pressure from the Australian government to free Assange, who is an Australian citizen. In September, a delegation of Australian members of parliament from across the political spectrum visited Washington and met with U.S. officials to lobby for Assange. Australia's prime minister was also just in Washington, and he brought up Assange with Biden at the White House. Australia's got a lot of leverage they could use, which they're not really using. they could be doing more to put the screws on Biden because they're signed this AUKUS military pact. The U.S. is building up its military footprint in Australia. Doesn't seem like they're trying to leverage anything, though. But this is good to see. And, there was earlier this year, Tlaib and a few of the progressive Democrats sent a letter to the Attorney General saying pretty much the same thing. And that was the first time I'm aware of in 2023 that people in Congress finally spoke up for Julian Assange. And he's been in Belmarsh prison since 2019 when they dragged him out of the Ecuadorian embassy in London. So, better late than never. But, that's, 4 years later. It took them a while. So hopefully this pressure does something. All right, so the last one here, the Slovak government rejects military aid for Ukraine. So Slovakia's new government under Prime Minister Robert Fico has rejected a plan to provide Ukraine with a military aid package that was approved by the previous government. So Fico, whose Smer SD party won elections in October, he campaigned to end military aid to Ukraine, and he's followed through on the promise. His government squashed this weapons package for Ukraine at a cabinet meeting on Wednesday. The military aid package included air defense rockets, 125 millimeter cannon ammunition, and 4 million rounds of small arms ammunition. So Slovakia, is a small NATO country, but they have been providing Ukraine with some significant military aid. They gave Ukraine their MiG-29 fighter jets. Those are Soviet-made jets, making them only the second country after Poland, the second NATO country, to give fighter jets to Ukraine. Only Poland and Slovakia have done it yet. You have the other European countries that have promised to send the F-16s, but the training's still in progress. So that's pretty significant aid that they gave. So this is, another sign that Ukraine is going to have trouble maintaining support in the West. Another thing that the new government is against is more sanctions on Russia. Hungary, up to this point, has been the only EU country that kind of tries to, blocks the sanctions on Russia, tries to get them watered down. And they can cause a lot of trouble, just one country opposing them. So now that there's two, it could be a lot harder for the EU to increase the sanctions. That is it for the news for today. Please go check out our Viewpoints. We have one from Kelly Denton Borhag, The Dehumanization of War, a meditation for Veterans Day, one from Matthew Ho, Armistice Day and the Empire, one from Reverend Graylin Scott Hagler and Ariel Gold, Where Are the Tears, one from Trenton Hale, The War on Civilians, and one from Ted Snyder, Beginning of the End of the War in Ukraine. That's everything. That is it for me for the week, actually. Hopefully everybody has a good weekend. Next week, I'll be taking the day off on Friday. Well, it's really Thursday, but there's not going to be a Friday show. I'm driving up to New York for the weekend. And so there'll be 4 shows next week. Monday through Thursday shows will be out. I'm just taking that Friday off. You could always support us by sharing this show, telling your friends about antiwar.com. Like and subscribe on YouTube, Odyssey, Rumble, wherever you prefer to watch. If you listen to podcasts, especially if you listen to it on Apple Podcasts, you could leave a rating and a review. That stuff helps out as well. But that's it. I'll be back after the weekend. I hope everybody has a good one. Thanks for listening.